Namaste and welcome. Today in our lecture series in the Yoga for Unity and Wellbeing program, 100 Days towards the International Day of Yoga, we have with us Dr. Richard Ribbon Fletcher. He is currently a research scientist at MIT Boston in the USA and also assistant professor at the UMass Medical School. Dr. Fletcher has a deep interest in behavioral sciences, behavioral medicine. Currently, Dr. Fletcher is leading the mobile technology group at the MIT Mechanical Engineering Department. He develops a variety of mobile sensors and tools to study behavioral medicine. Dr. Fletcher has done extensive work in India, collaborating with organizations that serve the rural and the urban poor with ongoing research studies with the National Institute of Health in India. He has so many publications about next generation emerging technology and wearable sensors that can help monitor our behavior. Now, Dr. Fletcher hasn't got that perspective of seeing technology as the enemy of the future, as the enemy of mankind. He sees that rather as something that can be used to help us map our consciousness, map yogic states, and understand just how so many things that we practice in yoga can be, measured and understood better if we had technology to help us. His work has been extensive, not just in India and USA, but also in Colombia, from where he hails. And today he's going to talk to us about a peep into the future, how these technologies can soon become a part of us, a part of yoga, and a part of our daily lifestyle. Let's listen to him. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Rich Fletcher. I hope you are all doing well. For today's lecture, I'm going to be giving an overview of emerging technologies that could be applied to yoga research. So if you give me a few minutes, I will try to get the computer set up here. And I hope you all can hear me okay. All right. So I'm with MIT and UMass Medical School here in the US. So as a start, I will say that 500 years ago or more, the sort of diseases that we worried about for health were mostly infectious diseases, things like cholera, diarrhea, things that were spread through the air or maybe through dirty water. And these were all infectious diseases. But an important milestone occurred in the 1990s, which was for the first time in history, non-communicable diseases actually became more important. So the burden of non-communicable diseases, also known as NCDs, is now greater than communicable diseases. And these are things like cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease such as COPD, and also we can't forget about mental health. Depression is one of the world's largest causes of disability. And if we look at the trends in all these chronic diseases, the trends are all going up. And a large part of this is just simply that the population of the world is getting older. But it's not just that, there is a higher incidence throughout the world. If we look at the causes of these diseases, non-communicable diseases, we see that there are a few main causes. Of course, there's genetics, there are environmental factors, and there are behavioral factors. But if you are able to have some control over your environment, we could sort of combine the behavior and environment. So there are two main factors, genetics and behavior. And as an example, if you look at the different types of cancer, about 40% of all cancer is preventable. And if you look at what are the different factors that can be prevented in cancer, we see that most of them are related to behavior. So we see that behavior is quite important. And because of that, about 50 or 60 years ago, around the world, we began seeing the emergence of what's called behavior medicine. So these are the people at the clinic or hospital who will counsel you about, how you eat, how you sleep, etc. Ways to improve your health by changing or improving your behavior. But what I want to tell you today is that there's more to the story than just this. It's not just genes and behavior, but there's another factor that is important that contributes a lot to disease in general, and that is our emotions, otherwise known as affect. So why do I think that affect is important? Well, we know that stress can negatively impact our health. If we have more stress, it's easier to get sick. We are more vulnerable to disease. And we can look at some research papers, for example. If we see some of the research that other people have done, we see that stress correlates with greater incidence of smoking, greater incidence of drinking, and also being overweight also correlates with stress. For those who have diabetes, we've also seen that stress correlates with glucose, and it also correlates with higher levels of insulin. There's a classic experiment that was done in 2007, which underscores some of this. And it is that it was done with these two mice. These were identical twin mice, so they were genetically identical, and both mice were fed the same food. So they both were fed the same, yet one mouse became much heavier than the other. And why is that? Well, the only difference was one mouse was left alone to live in a normal life with no interruptions, but the larger mouse was actually stressed. So he was stimulated with a lot of sound and lights and not allowed to sleep very often. His sleep schedule was interrupted. And as a result, because of the stress, the mouse grew larger and gained more weight. So this underscores the important role that stress has in the metabolism. And the other thing that's important to point out here is this very important relationship between the brain and the gut. And those of you who work with not only yoga, but also Ayurveda know that the digestive system is very important, and there's a very important link between the brain and the gut. And we're now starting to realize and understand that this relationship between the brain and the gut also affects other sorts of diseases that we never really understood before. So what does this all imply? Well, I think one of the main things that it implies is that we need to care about both the body and our mind. And we start to think about things like holistic health, which means that we need to take care of the brain as well as the body. But there are a few challenges. When we grow up and in school, we have health class, but we never really know, we're not really taught how to detect brain illness. And we're not really taught about what do we do to improve the health of our brain. We know that for our physical body, we should exercise, we should maybe run or do some specific, sit-ups or exercises. But for brain, we're not really taught what do we do to improve our brain or to improve the health of our brain. So this raises maybe a more fundamental question, which is, what does health really mean? If you have a blood test done when you go to the doctor or go to the lab, some people might think that, well, maybe your health are just some numbers in a blood test. If you have good numbers on your blood test, that means you're healthy. Is that what health really means? In my opinion, I say no. I think health is much more than that. Health is more than just a number on a test. I think health is defined by resilience. So it's more about how our body responds when our body is confronted with different types of physical stress or biological stress or psychological stress. And when that stress is removed, if we are in a good shape, if our body's strong and healthy, our body will recover fast. So this is called resilience. And I think that's perhaps a better measure, a better way of thinking about health. I also feel that health is about balance. So balance and moderation and everything, not just our behavior or what we eat, but I think moderation is important in general. And another aspect that I think is important is what I call self-awareness, or maybe our metacognition. We'd like to be able to have the ability to assess ourselves, to uh, appreciate and be aware of our health and our thoughts and our feelings. And for all of these things, I think yoga is important. So this is sort of a motivation and some of the reasons why I feel yoga is important and why I'm interested in working in yoga. Now, the topic of this talk is about technology. So the question is, what role can technology play in not just the practice of yoga, but also doing research in yoga? Well, I will briefly summarize two of the most common types of tools that are used in yoga research. And I will also mention the other area that I primarily work in. So the brain has a lot of electromagnetic activity. Of course, the magnetic fields produced by the brains are rather weak, so we mostly focus on the electric fields or potentials. And most of you are familiar with electroencephalography. So we can put on these electrode caps. They also make small ones for babies. And you connect this to a computer or some sort of monitor, and you can see the signals in your brain that we call brain waves, and they change as a function of time. And we also can see a signal for all of the different parts of your brain. So it's really a map of signals both in time and space. If we look at the waves in particular, now these waves that are produced by your brain are much lower frequency than, say, a cell phone or Wi-Fi. It's a much lower frequency, but if we look at the higher frequencies of brain waves, these are the sort of frequencies that are produced, let's say, when you're doing some type of concentration. And some of the lower frequencies is what you would see or what's generated when you are in deep meditation, or you might see during sleep periods of your brain. So there are a lot of researchers that are studying brain waves and looking at the different activities that are associated with those brain waves, and maybe trying to improve how your brain generates some of these brain waves to get your brain in particular states. And as you can see here, during sleep, your brain not only produces certain frequency waves, but also the waves also have a certain structure to them. For example, there might be some structures known as spindles in different stages of sleep. So in sleep research, a large part of sleep research is dedicated to studying the brainwave patterns as well. So in terms of emerging technologies, one of the interesting things that has been happening over the past several years is there's been new types of tools for measuring brain waves that are a lot more portable. So if you want to only look at a few points on your scalp, so the brain waves produced and just a few points on your head, you can now wear these glasses which detect the brain waves and then transmit signals to your mobile phone, or a computer, so then you can monitor it and then you can do other processing. They also have other bands, like this one, for example, has several electrodes that go across your forehead. So this gives us the ability to now being able to take these tools outside. So we don't have to be in the lab. Um, we can go outside or in a more comfortable place, and we can use them with mobile apps. This allows us to do biofeedback. We can listen to music or have some other interactive software that is used together with the brain waves, and this allows us to do um, new types of treatments and therapies. So some of the ongoing research today is looking at brain waves as they relate to attention and learning. So, many people are interested in education. Um, there's also a lot of interest in sleep and meditation. And something that's also emerging, of course, since the population of the world is aging, there's increasing focus on Alzheimer's disease. So people are interested in studying, for example, gamma waves and how do you improve the ability for your brain to produce more gamma waves, for example. Now, going beyond brain waves, there's another body of research that's interested in looking inside the brain and looking at different structures and mapping other functions of the brain. For example, you can look at different regions of the brain. You can go to a finer detail and see how the neurons in the brains are connected. There's a lot of active research in that area. And of course, we're interested in also studying the functions of the brain and which parts of the brain are responsible for different functions. And the main tool that's used in a lot of this work are large scanning machines such as this, the MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. So these are generally machines that are quite expensive and quite large and certainly not portable. So modern neuroscience today allows us to do experiments with live subjects. So you can go inside one of these machines and you could do some type of experiment where you think about certain things or you do some task, and the machine and the software allows us to study different parts of the brain and see which parts of the brains are active while we think about certain things or while we perform certain tasks. So neuroscience has advanced tremendously over the past 20 years or so, especially in the last 10 years, and it continues to advance today, and it's a huge field. This is a paper, there's a figure from a paper from 2018, and the topic of this, the title of this paper was, "What is consciousness?" So as you can see, researchers are now trying to ask, much deeper questions and understand, at least try to understand how the brain works, and looking at both function and spatial structure together. But now going back to the original question that I asked at the beginning of this talk, which was the role of emotion and disease. So how do we measure this? How do we measure emotion or what we call affect, and how does that relate to our brain? Well, if you look inside our brain, there's a part of our brain, basically that what's called the limbic system, and driven by this small part called the amygdala. And this section of our brain is roughly in the middle of our head, but this sits on top of the rest of our nervous system. And as many of you know, this is connected to what we call the autonomic nervous system, which is more or less outside of our conscious control. A lot of it happens subconsciously. And there are two parts, as is classically known. There's a sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic nervous system, sort of classically known as the fight or flight response. It increases our heart rates. It makes our palms sweat. It dilates pupil. And then there's the parasympathetic, which calms us down. So it decreases the heart rate, it stimulates digestion, and it contracts the pupil. So these two parts of our autonomic nervous system, they function in balance. And if you're healthy, they balance each other. So how do we use these organs that are connected to the sympathetic and parasympathetic system? How can we use this to actually measure different levels of activation? So how do we measure both sympathetic and parasympathetic? Well, if you look in the middle here, you can see that one of the main organs, of course, is our heart. And the heart is connected to both the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of our autonomic nervous system. So looking at how our heart behaves and the operation of our heart gives us a lot of information about what's going on. So for example, as you know, in a healthy heart, your heart rate jumps around. So here's a picture of your heart rate as a function of time. And if our heart was just a machine, so if our body was a machine and we just had a heart that pumped regularly, in between each heartbeat, there would be equal intervals, right? It would be a steady heartbeat, like bump, 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 and it wouldn't change. So that has low variability. But this is actually not how it works. In a healthy person, your heartbeat actually jumps around. So the space or the interval between the heartbeats is actually variable. And that's actually a healthy thing. That means that the feedback loops inside the heart and inside our body are working properly because our body is automatically speeding up or slowing down our heart rate depending on a multitude of variables. So in a normal healthy person, we see that the space between heartbeats changes. So we generally, when we're relaxed, we will have a reasonably good heart rate variability. But as we get sick or as we get older, you can see that disease actually causes the heart rate variability to go down. So as you can see, for example, on the upper left here is a plot from a patient with congestive heart failure, and they have a fairly constant heart rate. So it's basically a flat line. So that's not healthy because, as you can see, your heart rate is not moving. It's not variable. It's not varying. So in general, we can say that the more complexity you have and the higher heart rate variability that you have, that is a good thing. So that's what we want. Our heart rate variability also changes with response to stress. So as you can see here, when there is sympathetic activation, so the sympathetic nervous system is activated, it lowers your heart rate variability. So as you can see, instead of having this nice sort of varying heart rate as you see on the top, you have this sort of waveform that you see on the bottom in red color. So that is from, just an example of a waveform from a stressed person. The other thing that affects heart or your heartbeats is your breathing. So there's a coupling between your breathing and your heartbeat. So when you inhale, your heart rate slightly increases. When you exhale, it slightly decreases. So there's what is called an arrhythmia, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, or RSA, and this produces a modulation on your heart, your heartbeat patterns or your pulses, which can be used to extract respiration as well. But my main point here is that your heart beating and your breathing are coupled together, which is an important thing. So during normal respiration, if you breathe normally, here's an example from someone. You can see their heart rate on the top, and on the bottom, you see their respiration trace as a function of time. And now, if you suddenly start breathing fast for several minutes, as you can see, it does two things. One is it slightly increases your heart rate, but it also decreases your heart rate variability. That line doesn't have the nice slow waves anymore. It's more like a finer line. It's not variable. Um, but on the other hand, if you do a more relaxed breathing, this is what is known as slow segmented breathing, where you're taking slow deep breaths. Um, you get this nice, as you can see on the top trace, you get this nice variation in your heart rate, a nice heart rate variability. And this shows you how pranayama and your heart rate are coupled together. And you could measure all this quantitatively just by having a way of measuring your heart rate continuously. So, so how do we do that? What do we use for measuring our heart rate? Well, um, we would like to do it in using some tools that don't have wires. So one technology that I have developed several years back was a simple low power radar. So it's basically a little device with an antenna on it that's pointed at you, and it measures um, the motion of your heart. Because this signal goes through your body, it actually reflects off your heart and comes back, and you can actually measure the motion of your heart. And there's an example of a signal that's taken about 1 meter away from your heart. So basically, I was sitting down in front of this device, and this is the signal that was received by the device. So you can see here the individual heartbeat. So that's produced by the beating of my heart. And then the large modulation that you see, that's produced by my breathing. So basically the motion of my chest cavity or my chest wall is the low frequency variation. And then the finer pulses are actually my heart beating. This device can also be constructed in a smaller form, as you see here. And it could be, it's very low power, so it could be operated by batteries. And this one in this picture, for example, is something that you can wear on your chest. And because it's electromagnetic, it goes through your clothing. So it can actually measure your beating heart through your clothes. And it has a Bluetooth radio, so it collects the signal that you see on the right, and it sends that information to your phone, and then you can use that for whatever you want. And this plot on the right shows what the radar signal looks like on the top. Then on the bottom is an ECG signal that was collected simultaneously, so you can see how the ECG compares with the motion of your heart. There's another technology that we've also used for measuring heart rate. And this one, instead of using a radar, it's just simply a camera. So it turns out that the cameras in your phone or on a webcam, they can detect very tiny changes of color, right? And it's probably not surprising that the color of your skin actually changes as the blood pumps through your skin. So the perfused skin, as the blood is pumping through your skin, the color of your skin is actually changing very slightly. And if you write a proper algorithm for the camera software, you can actually detect these small changes in color. So here's an example. We were one of the first groups to do this on an Android phone. We did this back in 2015 on a Samsung S6, which you can look up that paper. And here on the right are the signals that were recorded by the phone. And the one in the middle is the signal that was produced by the algorithm that detected the heart rate. So you can see that is the heart rate as being detected by the phone camera just by looking at the color. And the phone is looking specifically at the forehead in this case and extracting the color of the forehead and looking at the changes. So what do you do with this technology? So one example, and this is in this photo, is a student colleague of mine from the MIT Media Lab, Dan McDuff, and he was one of the inventors of this method. And he's demonstrating a smart mirror. So you can have a mirror in your house, for example. So you stand in front of your mirror, and if this mirror has one of these technologies, it could be the camera, or it could be, let's say, the radar technology. It is looking at either your face, or it's measuring your beating heart, and it can scan you, and it could measure your heart rate variability and measure your heart rate. So this is the sort of device that in the future we may be able to have inside our house that could monitor our health. And as some of you know, there are already commercial devices. In fact, there's a commercial device that is called the Mirror, which is used for doing exercises at home. But in the future, these devices can also be able to monitor your physiology, your heart rate, and breathing using some of these technologies that I mentioned here. So this is the heart, and measuring the heart is fine. However, the heart is connected to both sympathetic and parasympathetic. So if the heart speeds up, for example, we don't know whether the heart rate increased because the sympathetic activation increased, or did it speed up because the parasympathetic activation was reduced. And the other problem, or the other confounding variable for heart rate, is that it depends on the heart disease, right? So your heart rate variability also has some dependence on the health of your heart. And also there's a coupling with breathing, because you can have some effect on your heart rate variability just through your breathing, as I demonstrated, or as I showed in the slide that discussed pranayama. So for this reason, we were looking at other ways of measuring our autonomic nervous system. So for that, we actually looked at the sweat, or your sweat glands that are around your body. So this is actually one of the oldest methods that was used in psychology. And it was actually dates back to the 1800s, maybe even earlier. And one of the interesting things about your sweat glands is that they're only innervated by your sympathetic nervous system. So basically, when your sympathetic nervous system is active, or is activated, or aroused, you start to sweat. And this is also particularly driven by the limbic and hypothalamus area. And one of the primary researchers of this measurement, and one of the pioneers, is Professor Roz Picard. And I was lucky to work in her lab for about 5 years. And I'm going to present to you some of the measurements that we did with some of my student colleagues at the time. My job as a hardware engineer was to build some of the electronics, and then several different people and other students use these in different experiments. So the other thing we should know about sweat glands is there's the different kinds of sweat glands. There's about three different kinds, and they all produce some signal, but we're primarily interested in the eccrine sweat glands, which produces a cholinergic response. And the sweat glands around your body, there's different sweat glands in different parts of your body, and different types of sweat glands in different parts. So the details are not so simple, but in general, we could measure skin conductance by putting some electrodes over these sweat glands and just simply measuring the resistance. So the general name for this measurement is called electrodermal activity. Sometimes we just call it EDA. So if you see the letters EDA, that means skin conductance. So this measurement, as I mentioned, has a very long history. You may be familiar with this as being used in lie detectors by the police or investigations. It's also been used by other groups for other types of meters. And what we did is we took the classic skin conductance measurement, which is done on the inner parts of your fingers, and we made a different version that works on your wrist. The reason we put it on the wrist is because we want a sensor that's mobile, that allows us to be ambulatory, because we want an ambulatory measurement so that we can put on the sensor and then go on with our daily life and without being disturbed. So the wrist is a very convenient place to do that. But first we had to demonstrate that the wrist actually gives us the same signal as the fingers. So we conducted that experiment, and here, as you can see on the right, we can see the difference between the red lines and the dark blue and gray lines, and it's showing that the wrist signals and the finger signals, they don't give the exact same signal, but they give similar signals. They both produce peaks at the same time. So that means the wrist is a valid place to do this measurement. And one of the things that I did was design different versions of these bands, some for the wrist and some for the ankle. So it turns out that the ankle is also another good place to do this measurement. So we also made ankle bands as well. And this is what just an example of one of the circuit boards, and has a Bluetooth radio that then sends the data to a phone, and you can see the data changing as a function of time, and you can save that and do other processing. So here's the example of skin conductance data for 24 hours. And this is data from a student. And you can see that the skin conductance changes depending on what activity you do. So as some of you know, your sympathetic activation can be increased in a few different ways. So one is psychological stress, which is we're primarily interested in. However, your sympathetic activation can also go up when you're doing physiological stress. So basically exercises. So as you can see here, when the student was playing squash, she had a large spike in her skin conductance. And then the third component is also cognitive stress. So basically trying to figure out a difficult puzzle, for example. So there are a few different components of sympathetic activation that can occur. The other thing I want to point out here in this slide is that as you can see, one of the activities in this plot is sleep. So we were quite surprised that when we go to sleep, we actually get a fairly large signal in a fairly large skin conductance signals. We were not expecting that. So that shows you that when we are asleep, your brain is actually quite active, and the emotional part of your brain is also quite active. So sleep is a very important part of our daily schedule. In terms of applications, one of the early areas that we worked on is autism. And for those of you who don't know about autism, autism is basically a developmental disorder in the brain, which impairs our social interaction. So with these with these deficits in social cognition, people with autism, especially lower functioning people with autism, have difficulty both detecting and understanding emotion and facial expressions, and also expressing emotion. So because of this, technology can actually play a useful role. So by creating a sensor band, as you can see in this baby, we have a sensor band put on the ankle. The sensor band can measure sympathetic activation. So if a child is getting excited or stressed out, even though if the child is autistic and cannot express this, we can detect that through the technology. So that is a useful tool for teachers or for parents, for example. Here is an older child. So the typical use for this technology would be for school-aged children. And in this case, we put the bands on the ankles so that they would not be distracting to the child. Some autistic children are very sensitive to lights and sounds as well. And as I mentioned, they can get stressed, and because they don't express their stress, the stress, if we don't know, the stress can continue to build until it gets to a very high level, and then the child will have a sudden breakdown or sudden meltdown, maybe start screaming or some emotional outburst. So through the use of this technology, we essentially have an early warning. So we know when the child is getting stressed, and before it gets to that high level, we can intervene. We could change activities, or we can give the child some soothing activity to help relax and calm the child down. The other area where we worked is I did some applications of this technology for studying behavior. So one of the interesting places you could study behavior is actually with animals. So I worked with rhesus macaque monkeys. These are non-human primates, as you can see in this photo. And I made special electronics that were put inside pockets of these jackets. So these jackets were worn by the rhesus macaque monkey, and or the rhesus macaque non-human primate. And this is some sample data. So the jacket contained both a skin conductance sensor, which you see the data on the top trace, and along the bottom, you see the heart rate. And the interesting thing I'll point out here is you can see that every time there's a spike or a large increase in heart rate, you also see a spike or a peak in the skin conductance. So this shows you that the sympathetic activation is coupled, and that's expressed in both the skin conductance and in the heart rate. So we can detect the periods of stress in the monkey by looking at these signals. So for doing behavior experiments, these monkeys live in a large cage at the university, and they are allowed to roam around freely inside this large cage, and there are multiple monkeys inside this cage. So you cannot do this experiments with humans, but you can do it with monkeys. So you can have a very controlled situation, and you can set up specific experiments. So for example, you can give food to one monkey and not give food to another monkey, and you can see how the other monkeys react. You can see dominant behavior and submissive behavior. So you can see all of these things happening in real time by looking at the signals, both skin conductance and heart rate, and conducting different behavior experiments. So this is one application of these sorts of sensors. And on this next slide, I showed data from a student, and this is data from an entire week. So we can see here the 24 hours for each day. And as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, the sleep signal really stands out. So even though we don't know the context, we without having a diary, we don't know what the person is doing throughout the day. However, during sleep, I can very quickly look at this data, and I can tell you exactly which parts are sleep. And that's very interesting. And from this, we can try to investigate how the sleep signal relates to the other activities they did either before or after sleep, and how it relates to their stress and sort of their emotional environment at the time. Because sleep is such an interesting period for our brain, one of the one of my other student colleagues at the Media Lab, her name is Akane Sano. One of the things that she studied was skin conductance during sleep, and one of the observations was that these large peaks or these large elevated levels of skin conductance, they seem to occur during slow wave sleep. So as you know, there's different stages of sleep, but it seems to occur in when we are kind of in the more deeper, slow wave part of our sleep cycle. The other thing that was discovered, and this was work from another student, Mingzer Po, and he included this in his thesis. We were surprised to see, well, maybe it's not surprising, but we sort of by accident, we discovered that it's also possible to detect a seizure if someone has epilepsy. These epileptic seizures are essentially an electrical storm in the brain, and certain types of seizures produce an enormous skin conductance signal. So as you can see in this plot, the peaks down below, as you can see between, let's say 2200 hours to 1 a.m., those are your standard skin conductance peaks produced by sleep. And the other very large peaks that are labeled as seizures, you can see that they are several times bigger than the sleep peak. So these are very enormously large signals that are produced during the course of an epileptic seizure. And because a seizure is a very important health event, and if someone in your family has a seizure, or someone in your family is having a seizure, you want to know that it's happening. So for safety reasons, you want to be able to, let's say, help them and make sure that they recover from the seizure. So because this was an important medical opportunity, Professor Roz Picard founded a company to sell this device for this application, and it's now become this product here. So it's called Embrace, and it's sold by the company Empatica. So it's just a picture of some of the devices that are sold for epilepsy detection. So this is one example of the sort of thing that you can do with this technology. The last thing I'll mention about skin conductance is that one of the challenges is that what we call valence. So valence is just like you learn in chemistry, having a positive or having a negative sign. So I can produce a large skin conductance signal in two ways. So if I am very happy, someone makes me laugh or stimulates me in a positive way, I can produce a large skin conductance signal. But I also produce a large skin conductance signal if I am angry or upset. So the problem is, how do we distinguish between positive emotions and negative emotions if they are both producing this arousal? So that's still an open question. Nobody has yet solved how to create a sensor that can understand and detect human emotions perfectly, but I can mention a few comments here. So in the 1990s and even before, people have probed the brain, and if you physically probe the brain, you can probe the right half. Let's say you probe the right side of the brain or the left side of the brain, and you can look at the skin conductance response. And one of the things that was discovered is that EDA, or skin conductance, is ipsilateral. So ipsilateral means, as opposed to contralateral, ipsilateral means that it's the same side. So if you stimulate the right side of the brain, you will see a signal on the right side of your body. If you stimulate the left side of the brain, you will see a signal on the left side of your body. So that's ipsilateral. And using that information, it was one of the ideas that we had was to try wearing a skin conductance sensor or measuring the skin conductance on different parts of your body and looking at the signals. So on this next slide, was other continuous other similar research that was continued, and it was done using MRI. And through this MRI and functional, fMRI, functional imaging, they also looked at how people's emotions are mapped to different parts of your brain. And you can also see that for different emotions, it's expressed in asymmetrically in different parts of your brain. So for example, it stimulates blood flow either more on the right side, for example, and that's one of the observations that was found. So with these observations, what we did was we created some experiments where we put a sensor band on both the left wrist and the right wrist simultaneously. So now a person is wearing two sensors. So here's an example of somebody who was wearing a sensor band, both on the left hand or left wrist and the right wrist. And in this case, the right wrist is the blue color, and the left is in red. And in this particular example, there was a death in the family. So unfortunately, this person was grieving for the person that had passed away. And what we see is that the right side response is much higher than the left side response. And the interesting thing was that this asymmetry in the skin conductance signal persisted throughout the day, and it also persisted at night. So even while the person was sleeping, the right hand signal was still much larger than the left hand signal. So, and then we see that after the first couple of days of grieving, when the person was starting to feel better and was recovering from grief, the signals became more symmetric. So they became more balanced. So, this is just sort of an anecdotal piece of research, so anecdotal observation. However, it gives us some insight that there is something interesting happening here, and that in the future, obviously there's much more research that needs to be done in this area, but we have seen evidence in this example and also in others where we can see that the asymmetry in the skin conductance signal does give us some insight, and it does seem to be consistent and give us some way to separate and distinguish between negative emotions and positive emotions. And other areas where this is now being applied is, besides understanding stress and anxiety, we're interested, one of the areas of my work is applying this to drug addiction and to craving, because we know that stress plays an important role in addiction and craving. Especially when you're recovering from addiction, if you have some stress, it gives you more craving, more impulse to actually use the drug or alcohol, for example. We're also interested in applying this to sleep, as I mentioned earlier, and also another interesting area of research is, again, looking at pranayama and looking at the connection to breathing. So on the topic of breathing in particular, I was also personally interested in finding new ways to measure respiration itself. So how do we measure breathing? And in particular, can we measure breathing without connecting any instrument to the person? So if we look at the way that respiration is classically measured, well, if you're in the hospital, they attach, they put this device, the cannula, in your nose, and it's connected to this machine on the left, which measures the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So this is one way of measuring breathing. But since your nose and your body produces warm, moist air, a very simple way of measuring breathing is just by looking at humidity changes, or putting a resistor under your nose. So when you breathe out, the humid air it lowers the resistance of that sensor. or you can use a temperature sensor. Just put a temperature sensor in your nostril, and as you breathe in and out, the temperature of that sensor will change, and that gives you a value of your respiration. Another classic way is just having a belt that goes around your torso, and if you use a material that has a variable resistance, that is, as it's stretched, um, you can see the change in resistance as your chest expands and contracts. So this is another simple way of measuring your breathing. But the problem with these methods is that they require wires. And for things like sleep studies, or even for doing, let's say, you want to do some yoga exercises in your house, we don't want to have these wires. So what we really would like to have is just a device that can be put in front of you, and you stand or sit in front of the device, and it could monitor your breath automatically at a short distance. So how does this work? Well, one technology that my group has been using is thermal imaging. So basically, these are mid IR, mid infrared cameras, and these are little thermal camera modules that connect to a mobile phone. So you can use a mobile phone or a tablet, and it lets you look at the heat image of the face. And in this slide, this is a diagram of your nose. And the only thing I want to mention here is that your nose has blood vessels, so it's warm. So essentially, when you exhale, you have warm air coming out of your nostrils, so it's hot. But then as you inhale, you have cooler air coming in. So if you just look at the temperature at the opening of your nose, basically at your nostrils, you could measure the respiration signal just by monitoring the change in the temperature. And here we see on this slide an experiment that we did. So we have a tablet, a computer, an Android tablet, and connected to the tablet is a small thermal camera module that's plugged into the tablet, and it's pointing at this student's face. So this is one of my former students, and we did this experiment at SVYASA Yoga University in India. And on this next slide, we can see some of our results. So the image to the left is what we see on the tablet. So you can see the thermal image of the student's face, and where you see the blue dots is basically his nostrils. So the software automatically finds the lower part of his face, and then we have to measure the temperature at these blue dots. And on the right side, we see two traces. So in this case, we're measuring both nostrils together, and the temperature is shown in the red color, sort of the red-orange color, and then the blue color is the signal from a impedance pneumography belt. So basically the chest strap that you wear, and which is one of the tools that I mentioned earlier for measuring respiration. And as you can see, these two signals track pretty well. So this shows that we can get fairly good respiration measurement just using this method. The other interesting and useful advantage of this method is that we could measure the left nostril and the right nostril separately. So if you're doing maybe some advanced pranayama, we can actually measure the respiration from the left nostril and the right nostril independently of each other, which could be useful for certain exercises. All right, so to sort of wrap up this talk, I would like to make some comments just about technology and how we use technology in our lives. So I call this, the mind, body, and the machine. In the current generation, especially the younger generations today, we are really growing up with technology. So technology in many ways is becoming part of our body. It's sort of an extension of our brain. So I think of this as a symbiosis. And we now have the field of mHealth, which involves not just a mobile phone, but also wearable sensors and other technologies, around our homes. We can now use this to do what we call interventions. So the technology can monitor what we're doing, and then it can give us some feedback. And that feedback could be some guidance about how we're doing. It could be some alerts. It could be some exercises. Um, so this can be a very useful relationship. Um, and one way to draw it is like this. I see this as a feedback loop. So basically, there's a human on the left, and the human is producing some signals or some data that is detected by the technology. And IoT is Internet of Things, and AI is artificial intelligence. So IoT and AI can be all of the device and all of the software that's in the devices around your house. So that represents technology in general. And then this technology then produces some feedback, some signal, or communicates some information back to the human. And this is a feedback loop. So it keeps going infinitely. And this can be used for many powerful things to do, for example, training, or to do some sort of therapy. But I think it's important to also think about, well, what is healthy and what is not healthy? Because even though the technology is, with every generation, technology is becoming more integrated with our lives and is becoming an extension of our lives, we still have to remember what it means to be human, and we have to think about, and decide how much dependence do we want? How dependent do we want to be on the technology? Some people are very worried and concerned that mobile phones are essentially becoming like a drug. Some people feel very stressed when they're separated from their phones, or if you take away the phone from somebody, they feel psychologically stressed. And some people are making the analogy to drugs, saying that this is an addiction. We are addicted to technology. We are addicted to phones. And there is some truth to that, something we need to keep in mind. The other harm, of course, is that technology is creating social isolation. So, many of us spend time on the phones, and sometimes we are more connected to the technology than we are to each other. So we have to be careful how we use technology. And as I mentioned earlier, everything has to be in moderation and staying in balance. One thing that I like to use as an analogy is training wheels. So I think technology should be used like training wheels on a bicycle. So how do you use training wheels? Well, when you're learning to ride a bicycle, before you know how to ride a bicycle, you put on these wheels, and the wheels help you to learn how to ride a bicycle, help you stay balanced. But once you know how to ride a bicycle, you're supposed to remove the training wheels, because you need to let your body ride the bicycle. And if you don't remove the training wheels, your body will get accustomed to the training wheels, and that's where you can have a problem. So I think if you think about technology the same way, it will be healthy. So technology can be used like these training wheels to help train you to learn new skills. But once you have developed those skills naturally, you can then remove that technology. So I believe very strongly in self-agency, and I think that is really the way technology should be used. The other analogy that I've seen some people use is basically, you could think of technology as a small motor that helps you pedal or power the bicycle. So, for example, if you're going up a hill and you need a little bit of extra help, or maybe some of us need more help than others, the technology can be like the small motor that's connected to a bicycle that just gives us a little bit of push. So notice that we don't want a two-wheeler. We don't want like a motorcycle without pedals, that just pedals for us. We want to keep the pedals. We want to make sure that we do the pedaling. We are in control. Our body is doing all the functions. The technology is just there as a little bit of a help or a little bit of assistance to help improve what we're doing and give us some feedback. I think that's the healthy way of thinking and thinking about technology, and the healthy way of using technology. So in summary, we can conclude in this way. I think future health technologies will include not just phones, but also wearable devices. And some of these sensors that I discussed can be embedded into things around our house, like furniture, sofas, maybe in the bed to monitor our sleep, into cars to monitor our stress, for example, while we're driving, and our health. They are also starting to be used in hotel rooms. So this is the complete environment, the lights, the sound, and being able to monitor our respiration and our breathing. It all goes together as a package. So once again, this is a feedback loop. But to use an analogy from the old Star Wars movie, I think thinking of the technology system in this way, the technology can be your friend, like the R2D2 robot here, that can be our assistant to help us. And it can also be like the teacher Yoda in the Star Wars movie, which is, can also, besides assisting us, it can also teach us new things and give us new abilities and train us. And it will help improving to develop our natural abilities. And now that we have a new set of devices that are now emerging, such as smart speakers and other things, other types of what we call Internet of Things around our house, there's now the opportunity to have this artificial intelligence everywhere in our living environment. And this could be a positive thing, because the technology is now becoming more natural, and it's accessible to people of all ages, whether you're old or whether you're young, and it's becoming easier to use. And if we don't forget that to use this in moderation and maintain a balance, I think it could be a very positive thing. And as shown in this photo, the technologies can be part of our daily life, and it can be used by everyone. So it can be used as a helper for ordinary people, to help them to do extraordinary things and to maintain a healthy body and mind. So I think with that, I'll conclude and just say thank you very much. And this is my contact information, and also the link to our research website. So thank you all for listening. Have a nice day, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments. Thank you very much.